We are in the middle of a series, though. It's called Practicing the Way of Jesus. Here's kind of the premise of what we want to go about, is being a Christian, it's a Christian, a little Christ, it doesn't mean that you agree with the things that Jesus said. It might surprise you. Being a Christian doesn't mean, there's a lot of things that we think it means, but what it means is it's a person who trusts Jesus. You put your faith and trust, the same word, and you believe that Jesus is exactly who he says that he is, that he is God, come to earth, lived, died, but here's where faith comes. And you are trusting and building a life on that as a foundation stone. It's very easy to attend a church gathering. It's very hard to be generous with our money to the point of this is foolish if Jesus didn't rise from the dead and that it points to something much more important in my life. To welcome strangers into your house for hospitality, just to be kind, it's that's stupid if Jesus is not who he says that he is. And so, in walking in the ways of Jesus, it's this walking in faith. But if you're like me, I have a long way to go before I resemble Jesus in a good way, because I tend to be selfish where Jesus is generous. I tend to be very, vicious and judgmental in my thoughts, whereas Jesus is oh, wow, he seems to be discerning but also kind and compassionate. And it's how do I go from that to this? And so that's the point of our sermon series. It's practicing the ways of Jesus. And we're specifically talking about different practices. Back in the day, we would call them spiritual disciplines or spiritual exercises or something like that. Kind of the spiritual activities we can do that can help us be changed to be more like Jesus. I'm going to have you go to a few different places in your Bible. The first one I want you to turn to is the book of Philippians, chapter 2. I'll have it here on the screen as well, but I'd love it if you got your paper Bible out because I want this to be helpful. Now, that idea of how do we change, how do we become different, how do we become more formed like Jesus? I think this verse is going to help us, but before we get to the verse, I want you to have the image of a sailboat. All right, this is a smaller crowd, I'm going to be interactive. Has anyone gone sailing before? Really? Oh, that's awesome. Okay, well, I own a TV, and so I've seen this, and so I think it's the same thing. So there's this race called the America's Cup, and it's amazing. And so they are racing sailboats, and you think a sailboat race, they must top out at 15 miles an hour or something like that? No, they're flying. They are going 80, 100 miles an hour. I have no idea. But you have this crew on the boat. One guy's cranking the wheel, right? Sail's going up. Another person's, they're grabbing the sail, and they're leaning way out. They're trying to trim the sail just to catch that wind just right. Someone else is working the other sail. They're doing this. Someone's trying to steer the boat, and they're steering it in just a way to utilize the wind. They are all sweating and working furiously. Do you know that not a single person has a paddle or an oar? What kind of race is this? It's because no one is actually pushing the boat forward. The wind pushes the boat forward. They are working hard to utilize the wind, to line themselves up with the wind for their speed. And look at this verse with that image in mind. It's talking about how do we change. It says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So who's working? Darn right he is. It's someone's got to work, you guys. That's awesome. Both. A sad spiritual truth is, I don't know if you've learned this in life, if you're old enough you might realize this, you can't really change yourself. I've tried. And I could do little bits here and there, but I tend to kind of bungee rope myself back to where I was. I need God to change me. But God doesn't just magically shoot you with a change gun and wow, I'm different. He wants you to also work out your own salvation. And so just like that sailboat, it's the wind, which is beautiful because the Greek word for wind and the Greek word for spirit is pneuma. It's the same word. It's the spirit that needs to propel you into change. and you get to also work of opening yourself up to what God is doing in your own life. Does that make sense? And so as we think about these practices, as we think about these activities that we can do, know that you can't change yourself, but what you can do is open up yourself. You can raise the sail, or I could lower the sail if I want to be open to what God's doing. So with all that being said, here's what I want you guys to try this week. Once again, this is a very practical sermon series. It is this thing called an end-of-day reflection. You're welcome for the name. And it's very simple. At the end of your day, so ideally 7 days a week, if you get to like 2 or 3 or 5, that'd be great. You just sit down and you ask yourself really 2 questions I'm going to recommend. The first one is, when did I notice God's presence today? When did I notice God's presence today? And the second one is this: what did Jesus give me today? What did Jesus give me? So I'm asking, where did I notice God's presence? And what did I receive from Jesus today? And these questions, they're not magic questions, but there's some reason for these questions. Because even asking these questions, they are setting ourselves up where we are, in faith, going to trust that certain things that God says are actually true. By asking the question, where did I notice Jesus today? What I'm assuming is that he was in my entire day. See, theologically, we believe that God didn't just make the world and leave, that God's presence fills the entire earth. In Psalm 139, David, he starts to kind of think of, where could I go from your spirit? Where could I flee from your presence? And so no matter what your day was full of, if it was, awful Zoom meetings and phone calls and billing, or if it was the worst parenting moments, or if it was with third period math, whatever it is, he was there. But what isn't always there is our awareness of God's presence with us. And so we want to ask, thinking back, when did I notice you? Because you were there. I'm going to trust that you were there. I just don't know, I didn't notice it. I felt very alone. I felt very anxious. I felt all these things. And actually that question, a good tip is, a way you can notice God's presence is look at the fruits of the Spirit. Because there's a good chance if you are experiencing love and joy and peace and patience and kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, there's a good chance you are living kind of with awareness of the Spirit in your life. Whereas if you are anxious and fearful and chaotic and all these things, there's a good chance that I was living out of awareness of God's presence. Does that make sense? And so that first question, it helps us look in the rearview mirror of our day of, where were you, God? But eventually we start to notice them in the moments as they are happening. The second one of, what did I receive from Jesus? It stands on this theological truth of, God is the giver of all things. Right? He actually wants us to know him as a good father who gives good gifts, which means my day, he's constantly giving me things. Now, sometimes it can be something really cool where a friend unexpectedly texts you. Have you ever gotten that? Where you're just like, oh man, you have no idea that this couldn't have been better. And it was just some stupid emoji, but somehow it's like, that's what I needed. Thank you. Someone noticed me today. Well, Jesus might have inspired that. And so we can see these moments, but also sometimes the gift can be, wow, God, in this very chaotic moment, I had self-control. I have no idea where that came from. That clearly came from you in that time, because I've seen how I act. And so we can see and we can start to have a posture of looking for God's movement in our life. And we do that through this end-of-day reflection. So if you're like me, trying to think practically, how does your day end? Think through how you end your day. And so if you have a little table or something like that, have a book, put your pen there. If it's not there, if you have to go hunt for it, you'll never do it. I need the visual reminder for me, or else next thing you know, I'm asleep. For me, this is actually great to do with someone else. As a parent, we do this around the dinner table with our kids, where we just ask how your day was, but we also ask, where did you see Jesus at school today? And sometimes the answer is nothing. It was the worst, right? Sometimes it's like, this friend played with me, right? Different things. But we're training our kids of like, well, he's there, he's doing things. But as a family, it's helpful. Like with me and my wife, we do this as we're brushing our teeth. At one point, we had the questions written on our mirror, and we can talk about them as we're brushing teeth and stuff. So like, however you want to do it, doing it is what is helpful. And we're not looking for some huge hour-long masterpiece. It's these like consistent 5 minutes end-of-day reflection that they start to build on top of each other, where you're gaining this awareness. And the beauty of this is you're also not talking, you're listening. We're going to get to why that is, but there's a good chance you already know your own opinion about your day. You're like, I know exactly what it was, I liked it, or it was the worst, I want to move on as fast as I can. But what I don't know is, what did God think of my day? That sounds like very important information. And so even just ending the day in the posture of listening is so helpful. So this practice, it does come from a kind of a Christian tradition. There's this old kind of desert saint. His name was Ignatius of Loyola, which is where Loyola Marymount is named after. But it's kind of beautiful. He has this quote. He says, "The unexamined life is not worth living," which is not to say that your life is not worth living, but the point is, if we aren't looking back and reflecting and examining what God is doing in our life, what are we even doing? Because there's a good chance God's at work, but we might be missing it. And we want to know that. So that's the practice. It's not really a magic practice, but it really helps all these things. I'm going to spend the rest of our time together explaining why this is helpful and kind of going back and forth. So I'm going to have 3 points here, old school sermon, 3 points, 3 verses. Let's go, all right? The first reason why this can be very helpful to you as you walk with Jesus is that it utilizes the trials of our life as spiritual content. So there's a good chance, if you're alive, you have hard things in your life. In the Bible, at times it calls them trials. Sometimes it calls them fiery trials. When your faith is tested. And that sounds very nice to hear in a building. It's air-conditioned. We're sitting around at Sunday. We all like... Just the premise of your faith is going to be tried and tested. Let me unpack that for a minute. Faith is trusting Jesus. I already talked about that. It's who he says he is. For that to be tested, it means there's going to be things in our life that are going to bring us to the point where we are going to question, I don't know if God actually is good, because look at around me. How could a good God allow boom, 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 boom? And sometimes that's a mental exercise, and sometimes it's the life you're living of like, I don't know. I don't know if it's worth it. That's what he's talking about. He's saying we are going to experience trials in our life where our faith, and he's saying, what if we use that as spiritual content? So if you're not there, turn to James chapter 1. This is one of the most common verses in the Bible. The book of James, chapter 1, we're going to look at verses 2 through 4. I love this because the book of James is written by Jesus' younger brother, which, if you want proof that Jesus is God, his family worshiped him as God, which I know my family, clearly not God. I don't know how you guys were raised, but to worship your brother as God, that is impressive. You know something unique happened there. But the book of James, chapter 1, what James says here, it feels like he's completely out of touch. I'm going to be honest. Here's what he says. Consider it pure joy, or count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Really, James? For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Or some versions of the Bible say endurance. Some will say perseverance. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. That sounds a little unhinged. Can we agree with that? Like, count it joy when I question that God is doing what he's saying because I'm going through such a hard time. He's like, yeah, that's the good stuff. I'm like, James, why don't you just stop talking for a while? I don't want that. If you're like me, when I'm going through a difficult time, which it feels like we're just trading off which difficult thing I'm going through, my prayers are often, God, get me out of this, right? Send money, send new friends, send new family. Like, let's start all over. And he says, actually, you could consider it or count it all joy when you're going through this. And he actually tells us why. He's not saying, think it's a great thing. It's like, no, it's hard. There's plenty of compassion, by the way. But God is doing something. In that fiery trial, he's doing something. In the NIV, I use that. It says that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, and let perseverance finish its work. Or in this one, let steadfastness have its full effect. That as we are going through these trials and these difficult times, you're going to go through them anyway, right? There's no way you can escape life free of trial. And so what he's saying is good news. God is using that in your life to produce something in you. And later on he says, guess what? Eventually this trial, this forging of your character and your heart and your faith, it's going to make you perfect, complete, lacking nothing. That there's going to be an end result that actually makes it worth it. I think of like when you know, like I'm going to use the example of my own grandfather. When he passed, just the compassion, the gentleness, just the heart of gold on this man. I know he wasn't born that way. But he had gone through so much, right, that what was left is like everyone wanted to be around this man. I'm like, I want that. But the way you get there is not through just raining down blessings. It's through a fire. It's through being forged. And he's saying, you can have joy in this because that means God is at work and he's doing something in you. And we have to let perseverance finish its work. And so the beauty of this end-of-day reflection is, if you're already going through the trial, what if you opened yourself up to it and said, God, I'm willing to ask the question, what are you doing? Where are you? I know you're here, but I don't see you. So where are you? How could I notice you in this trial? What are you giving me in this trial? And so even though you want to do everything to avoid thinking about it, you're actually saying, I'm going to trust you enough to say, what are you giving me? What are you doing? The second thing that this practice is really helpful with, and this is one of my passions, is it helps us see our blind spots. Now, a few of you guys are young enough that you don't drive yet. Those of you who drive, right, we have blind spots in our car. But usually they're behind you, and if you drive fast enough, who cares, right? No. That was a joke. Thank you. You laughed. Okay. My kids have no concept of blind spots, but in our character, in our spiritual life, we also have blind spots. Let me interact with you for a moment. Think for a second of an arrogant person that you know. If any of you guys are thinking of me, I'm going to be so hurt. All right? Just think of that arrogant person. Do they think that they're arrogant? Probably not. I don't see anyone doing this. Everyone's like, no. It's like, no, they think they see themselves accurately. Think of a person who has little to no self-confidence. Do they think that they have no self-confidence, or do they just think that, like, well, I kind of deserve it, right? They're blind. And we have our own blind spots, and the hard thing about a blind spot is there's nothing you can do to fix your own blind spots because you're blind. So we need something to open us up. Turn to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17. If you have an app, it's very helpful. Jeremiah is right in the mix, right in the thick of the Old Testament. I also like the table of contents in the front of your Bible. It's very helpful. Jeremiah 17. Jeremiah is this prophet in the Old Testament. He's actually, in one sense, life is just trial for him and hard times. And a lot of his book is him pouring out his heart saying, God, this is the worst. No one listens to me. No one's doing this. My life is awful. Chapter 17, verses 9 and 10. Here's what Jeremiah, he realizes about himself. The heart is deceitful above all things. It's desperately sick. Who can understand it? Now let's pause right there. Here's what Jeremiah is saying. My heart lies to me. Right? The world wants you to follow your heart. Oh, please don't. It is a hot mess. I don't even know you that well, and I know it's a mess, right? He's like, your own heart lies to your brain about what's actually inside of there. And he's like, guess what? It's not just lying, it's sick. Have you ever wondered why did that thing come out of you the way it did? And you're like, where did that come from? It's because you're sick. And your heart lies to you. And Jeremiah, who's writing scripture, that's impressive, he says, well, who could understand my heart? And I like it because then the Lord I have something to say. The next verse, I, the Lord, search the heart, test the mind. I give each man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his labor, or of his deeds. And so, while we have blind spots in our own life, the Lord sees us clearly. This is a side note from what we're trying to teach, but this is how the love of the Lord is so different than anyone else. Because me and Celeste, we work together, we're getting to know each other very well, we become very good friends, but I know Celeste only this much, right? And there's so much about her that I don't know. And so my love for her could be, in one sense, it's limited. Even my love of my own spouse, like Courtney, it's limited. As much as we want to have this unconditional love, the reality is there's conditions of our love. And there's things that we can learn of I don't know if I like that about you anymore, right? But for God, who has no blind spots about you, when he declares, I love you, there are no conditions to his love for you. He's like, I see all of it. I see more than you see. And I say, yes, you are loved. Yes, I am for you. Yes, it's all removed. Even the sins you're not aware of, I've removed those as well. The cross is that beautiful. The cross is that complete. That's a side note, but he has no blind spots. But I just want to share, we can have a lot of different spiritual blind spots. I kind of want to hone in on two just for our purposes as we're thinking about trials in this reflection. The first blind spot could be this. We can have a blind spot in our faith if the things that we are trusting in our faith is actually a bad object, right? It shows us what we actually trust. Because what's difficult is we are blind for the thing of our trust if it is actually trustworthy. I'm not going to have you raise hands. This morning, I realized my daughter is now officially in 6th grade. She is now a middle schooler. What's weird is I moved out to the Conejo Valley in 2007 as a middle school pastor, and now I am the parent of a middle schooler, and I'm like, I don't know. I feel a little old today. I don't know. But we can have these things that we trust in our life, and we don't know if they are trustworthy. The illustration is, without our showing hands, how many of us trusted someone in middle school or high school with something about us, and they used that to betray you or to, stab you in the back? It's like, everyone. Was the problem that you told someone the truth? It's like, no, I told a person who was untrustworthy. That was my problem. The object of my trust was bad. And that gets revealed through the tension, right? If it's the middle school popularity game that's, the worst, it's like, well, it forges and we see who our real friends are. But how do we see if the object of our spiritual trust, if that is worthy? And it comes through trials. Now, here at Anthem, I'm going to give you guys an illustration. We have Matt, about a year ago, he had this famous illustration that he said, faith is trust, and it's kind of like a chair. Like, you guys can sit in a chair. You can know that this chair is worthy of your weight, but until you actually sit in it, it's knowledge, and it's sitting in it is faith. All right? But what's funny about that illustration, some of you guys already know, that week we had ordered 200 new chairs for our church, and that week alone, 6 of them gave out. We actually call it chairpocalypse, right? Just boom, boom, boom. Someone actually got hurt. We're like, oh my gosh, this is awful. Matt, stop using the illustration. But it's beautiful because the problem wasn't the illustration. The problem is that there was a bad object of trust in the illustration. I'm going to ask for something here. Could I have a volunteer? I actually want to, like a kid. Is there a kid volunteer? I'm a youth pastor. I'll give you candy if you volunteer. Anyone? You have to volunteer yourself. You want to come up? Come on up. I'm not going to trick you. I'm not going to do anything mean to you, okay? I promise. I love it. Hey, bud, what's your name? Isaac? I love that name. All right. All I need you to do is you're going to stand right in front of this chair, okay? You can do this one right here. Oh, actually, that's the perfect one. I have one more volunteer. It can be an adult, too. All right? I'm not going to self-identified adult. There we go. Thank you. And what's your name? Kayla. Thank you, Kayla. All right. So this famous anthem illustration right there, the chairs broke and it showed this. What I'm talking about is what happens if the chair, we think these chairs can bear our weight, but it is only through kind of the stress test of life that we actually find out if something we believe can handle the weight of the stress test of life. And so what I did, now Isaac, he kind of already knows, I modified one of these chairs. I'm not going to tell you which one. She's like, do I trust this person? I've never met you, Kayla. You seem so nice. And so what I want you to do is I'm going to count to 3, and I want you to, like, in front of the chair and just, like, pretend like you just worked, a 12-hour day, and you just, you've had enough. It's all Zoom calls or whatever it is, and just, poof, I just want you just to go darn. So Isaac, I want you to sit in the chair as hard as you can on the count of 3. He weighs like 20 pounds. It's not going to. All right, 1, 2, 3. There we go. Okay. I did not modify a chair. Thank you very much. Okay, give my hand of applause. Yeah, earlier I had all kids, and people were legitimately like, is he about to hurt a child? I'm like, no. Yeah, we know. The point is, the chair looks fine. We could even talk about it in abstract, but it's like, what happens if you actually come down hard on that? And here's what it is. What if the thing that we trust in our life, in our spiritual life, we can have sincere faith, but if it's sincere faith in something that's not trustworthy, that's bad. And a gift that God can give us from trials is the thing you're trusting is not trustworthy. You ought to know that when we die, we stand face to face before Jesus. And as a judge, it's like, I want to make sure I'm trusting the right thing. And what a gift if I found out in 2022 that I was actually trusting something that wasn't trustworthy. I'd rather that pain happen than end-of-life pain. And a gift is God exposing that. So many people believe that if you are a good person, fundamentally, you will be in heaven. Who determines that you're a good person? And a lot of people, they have put all their chips on the good person page. And I'm like, well, did you ask your enemy if you're a good person? Just the friends you like? Not the old friends who you hate now, but just, it's very subjective. It's very shaky. Are you sure you want to trust your life with that belief? If there's other world religions and things, anything other than Jesus, there is no other name under heaven given by men by which we can be saved. It's only Jesus. And so to trust anything, especially yourself, for faith and salvation, I need to know the truth. And a gift that comes from trials and this reflection of opening ourselves up is we can see, wow, the thing I'm trusting in ain't going to it's not going to hack it. The second blind spot that we can see is that it shows us if our faith itself in Jesus, if that is real. It shows us if our faith in Jesus is real. There's this thing called fool's gold, right? My kids love it. It's just like glitter rocks. Like, no one knows what it actually is. It's just a mystery. But it ain't gold. And it's seemingly everywhere. And you think you're rich. But it's called fool's gold because you're the fool for thinking that it's gold. And we need to see that. And we need to have it go through really the counterfeit. Think of this. Just like fool's gold is fake gold, we have counterfeit faith. that we can think we have faith in the real Jesus. We have the right object, but our faith itself is that sick, lying heart of ours. We think we trust it, but when we go through a trial, we find out we trust something different. When 2020 first hit, a lot of people, when the stock market did the initial before it did its big old thing back, a lot of people were opening up apps to see, am I going to be safe? Running to see if finances are going to save me. We're not against money, but it ain't going to save you. Right? When we think of different things we run to, we fool ourselves all the time. And the gift of, wouldn't you want to know that? That your very faith itself was misguided. Matthew chapter 7, if you want to turn there. It talks about counterfeit faith. And so Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's talking about this life of the kingdom of God, of all these amazing ways of following him and how the law of God is, he shares all this, and then he gives this paragraph that's incredibly sobering. And he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." It says, on that day, right, that day of judgment where we stand face to face before Jesus, many are going to say to Jesus, "Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name?" That's impressive. "Didn't we cast out demons in your name?" That's cool. "Didn't we do many mighty works," or some translations, it's miracles, "in your name?" Then I will tell them plainly, or I will declare to them, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness." Here's what he just said. There are going to be people. See, it's very easy to attend a church service. But he's like, no, there's going to be people, they're not just church attenders. These are people who are going to be foundational to the life of a community of a church. They're going to be prophesying. They're going to be doing miracles. They're going to be like hosting community groups. They're going to be doing all these spiritual activities. They're going to be casting out demons. But the essential of their faith was fool's gold. They were filled with spiritual activity and spiritual stuff. But they never actually trusted Jesus. They always trusted something else. That's sobering. I want to know if that's me, right? And this reflection is as we're going through trials, we get to see God. Where am I running to? Am I running to you? Am I actually trusting you? Because there's no amount of morality, there's no amount of spiritual stuff that saves you, right? It's by grace that we are saved. It's through faith. But it's that real faith of God's grace to save us. And so when this trial happens, our faith is exposed. And we see, what do we really run to when we're going through it? And we don't like going through it. But what a gift to know the truth. That lying heart of ours can't lie when it sees us run to money or when it sees us run everywhere but Jesus. It's a gift. It is a gift. And so it's kind of interesting. I think the theme of the morning seems to be youth ministry. One of the hardest things has been when I was a youth pastor for almost 15 years or more. So many students had this amazing life, and they were active, and they were doing these things, and they memorized the verses, and they were fully involved. But the reality is their faith was a positive peer pressure because all their friends were involved in church. And as it's exposed through trials of life, the reality is like, I don't know if that was faith. I'm glad they can see truth of themselves because it was almost undistinguishable in high school. Another popular thing, men, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. The common story at a church is you have a spiritually mature wife dragging a husband along who does just enough. Come on, man. It might be fool's gold. Don't worry about my opinion of it. Worry about God's opinion because he doesn't have opinions. He only has facts. So whatever he knows and whatever he thinks, that's what I want to know. And it's by opening ourselves up from the trials, not running away, but actually saying, God, show me. Show me what's going on in this heart that you've searched. And so The last verse I want us to go into, it's kind of part of the third point. My favorite chapter in all the Bible is Psalm 139. I love it. At the very end, after David has spent this whole long poem thinking about how God knows me and he has searched me, and everywhere I go, he is. In the dark times, in the hard places, he's there. If I go everywhere, right? I knit you together in your mother's womb. Like, God, you've known me before I was like cognizant. Like, this is amazing. At the very end, he says, search me, O God. Know my heart, because it's only God who can know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, right? Trial me, test me. Because I want to see the anxiety things that come out. See if there's any grievous way in me, which is funny because there's plenty of grievous ways in this. But here's the key, and lead me in the way everlasting. Those two verses right there, they form as a type of prayer that some people, instead of my questions, they use these verses for this end-of-day reflection of saying, God, what were my thoughts like today? And where were you in my thoughts? God, what were the actions? How did I respond today? Ugh. Okay, God, you forgive that. You forgive that. That was cool. You did something there. Thank you, right? But really, it's this idea of God is leading us as we are walking in the ways of Jesus. We want to practice the ways of Jesus. And we're saying, you're leading me somewhere. I wish it was to peace and prosperity right now in this life and just rain down blessings. But sometimes he leads us out into the wilderness. I think of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the Old Testament where he leads them clearly into a fiery furnace to be burned until they die. It's like, God, that's not the leading me that I was asking for. I was just hoping for like a zero in the bank account, behind the numbers, not in front of the numbers. But it's through those fiery trials that if we open ourselves up, we actually realize Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, everyone who was watching them in that furnace, they said, wait, there's a fourth person in there. We believe it was Jesus himself was in that furnace with them. And he was revealed with them only in the furnace, although he was with them the whole time. What a gift if we can open ourselves up to these trials and not just run from them and say, you know what, God? I want to experience you. Show me. Where are you? What are you doing? What are you giving me? It could change that perspective. I actually want you to test me because I want to see the truth. You know, I didn't get this when I was in school, but I finally, as a parent, I see the gift of it. The point of a pop quiz, they're the worst. Right? It's like, hey, it has no effect on your grade, but I just want you to feel bad about yourself. You're like, oh, thanks. Here's the gift of a pop quiz. You see the truth. You think you're going to do great, and then you get back and you got a 2 out of 10 on the pop quiz. You're like, oh, boy. It's like, yeah, study. You know nothing, right? You just guessed on those 2 you got right, too. And so the gift of a pop quiz is you can see reality of how you're actually stacking up to what needs to be known. Well, God's like, hey, these trials, they show you what's really life like. You need to know if you have fool's gold. Because you might be caressing it and like, yeah, look at my faith. It's beautiful, isn't it? It's like, you got a rock painted gold. That thing's worth nothing. But you're living your life with it. And when the trial comes, it's not going to sustain you. And the gift is God says, yes, I can sustain you. Now you can actually come to me. And in grace, he's like, yeah, I love it. Some of my favorite stories are people coming to faith who were in churches for decades because God was gracious and showed them, hey, guess what? I'm still here. There's no embarrassment. And so the last point here is that we can assist what God is doing in our life. Just that image of the sailboat from before. If we're going through a trial, if the Spirit is leading us, now that we know, if we're asking these questions and we're saying, God, what are you doing? Where are you? I can now know what God's doing in my life if he shows it to me. And now I get that choice. Do I want to raise the sail up and say, yeah, God, I'm willing to go into the furnace. Yeah, I'm willing to be in that hard place with my family and endure. And I'm willing to let perseverance finish its work even though I don't like it at all. Or am I going to say, nah, I got this. I'm going to lower the sail. I'm going to get out my own paddle. I'm going to try to go where I want to go in my own life. God allows you to resist him. He does. You lose out on the benefits, you lose out of the change, you lose out of all these amazing gifts. But he's gracious enough to say, yeah, I'll let you do that. And so sometimes the question isn't, God, what are you trying to teach me, as in something I need to learn mentally? Sometimes it's the refining, right? It's these things of, God, you're growing something inside of me to be this different person who actually resembles Jesus in these different moments. That if you're a teacher who is, Lord willing, you're on, summer break now, it's like, oh, I get the roof. I want to act differently in my classroom. As parents, I want to treat my kids with even more patience and compassion and wisdom and all those things. But I want that to kind of be a part of who I am, not just the bright moments. I want those to be the normal moments as well. It's interesting. I want to, as I'm closing up here, I want to share kind of from my own heart on this. This practice, I kind of I learned about it 12 years ago, but it's really been these last few years that I've really felt the Lord just forging in my own life. This might be like shocking to everyone here, but these last few years have been some of the hardest years of my life. I think it's almost universally true. If we took a straw poll, probably 80% of this room would say, yeah, these last few years have been some of the hardest years of our life. The things I'm good at, and I don't lack confidence, I'm good at some things. Those are irrelevant to what God has me doing right now. And I'm like, oh man, I want to do the stuff I like. It's like, no, that's cool. And all of a sudden I'm in all these places and these situations and these moments where it's like, hey, you're going to be weak for me. I'm like, oh, again? Hey, with your family as we're forging, you're just going to be present. And we're going to let perseverance finish its work. And I'm like, oh, is it done yet? But there is joy. That, like, I don't have to tell you, you guys have lived this life. There is joy in trials. Not just diluted, self-medicated joy or whatever that is, but genuine, from the bottom of your soul, joy welling up because, wow, God, you are at work. You are doing something. And that's something that we can open ourselves up to. Spiritually, there was a time where I was convinced, like, if we get a little too deep, it's like, oh man, it's kind of dark down there. I don't know if I want to go into my own heart. You know who resides in your heart with you? Jesus. What a gift. And so this invitation into reflecting on your day, I don't have to tell you to like enjoy the good times. I want to kind of sell to you that you can actually open up to the hard times as well. Because that's the one that we want to resist. But that's also where the Lord says, my love is even deeper. My presence is even that much stronger at times in the furnace. He walks with us. And so I want to recommend this practice to you guys. Try it once, try it twice, but the beauty is just those little 5-minute increments that just kind of like Lego bricks start stacking on each other, and you increase this awareness, and he starts to show you, yeah, I got you, and all those things. So I'm going to have the band come on up here. I'm going to pray. Jesus, I thank you, God, that you are so good. You love us so much that you are going to blow, and your wind is going to propel us to change, to be more like Jesus, to have more love and joy and peace. And God, that these trials that we're going to experience, we can open ourselves up, and you're right in the middle of them. And so, God, I pray that we could just embrace and be willing and to trust you. Show us the things that aren't you. Show us the idols. Show us all the things that can't handle it, because we want what's real. Lord, we want you to lead us in the way everlasting. So you never pray. Amen.